Seymour, 5-minute call.
Mr Speaker, I rise on behalf of the ACT Party in opposition to this bill, but I start by commending the Honourable Minister for bringing an RMA reform bill to the House, because RMA reform is, in my view, the #1 regulatory priority for this country. And don't just take my word for it. As the Minister said, it's also in the view of the OECD, the Productivity Commission, Business New Zealand, the New Zealand Initiative, Federated Farmers, and so the list of stakeholders who have observed this issue goes on. RMA reform is important to New Zealanders for one reason, is housing. Mr Speaker, in the 60s and 70s, New Zealand built 8 to 13 residences per 1,000 head of population. This century, the period of the RMA, 5.3 residences per 1,000 of population. That housing shortage has been directly sheeted home to the land use planning environment, not just in New Zealand but around the world. That is what the international evidence tells us. And Mr Speaker, the shortage of housing has led to a price bubble that now imperils equality and equity for New Zealanders, but also the stability of our financial system. And if you doubt that, don't ask me, ask the Reserve Bank Governor. And sadly, Mr Speaker, this bill is completely disproportionate to the challenge facing New Zealand and the level of RMA reform that is actually required to get the outcomes that the overwhelming majority of New Zealanders want. It is not reform, Mr Speaker, it is tinkering. It fails to stop the culture where councils produce, as the Minister mentioned, 10-metre high stacks of rules and plans for our communities. The fundamental problem and the reason that we get those high piles is not because we lack a template or we lack enough electronic processing, although of course any government should be doing those things. The fundamental problem is the principles section, the underlying assumptions of the Resource Management Act, which say that there have to be 18 different principles, such as the intrinsic value of ecosystems, which nobody can properly define, considered in every single plan. And if you cannot define what you want to have in the plan, then it doesn't matter whether it is the central government setting the template or local councils writing the plan. You still have a planning ethos that puts more value in the ideology of the planning profession and third-party objectives than in the actual owner of the property. Among those principles does not appear once property rights. That is something the Honourable Amy Adams wanted to put in RMA reform and sadly has not been able to be included in this bill. Even the idea of competitive consenting, which would have been an enormous incentive to improve the quality and speed of consenting, could not be included in this bill, although that would be a very good improvement. Mr Speaker, I hope to come back for future readings and be able to vote for some of those characteristics in this bill. But not only does the bill at present not solve the fundamental problems, it adds new ones. An ambiguous requirement to accommodate natural hazards will add yet another layer of complexity in the plans and the consenting processes that property owners and businesses in New Zealand face when they try to do things with their own property. The new requirement to universally consult with iwi adds another third party that must be consulted when developing one's own property. This again is not progress towards people being able to use their property efficiently. It is actually another step backwards. And yet, Mr Speaker, and yet we always say this is a trade-off between the economy and the environment. It is not. Most of the red tape, most of the principles, most of the conditions that I resent and would like to reform in this Act are not actually environmental. Most of them are about nebulous principles that have nothing to do with the science of the air, water and soil purity, of biodiversity and of the noise and disturbance to people by their neighbours. Mr Speaker, we want a country whose productivity growth puts us in the 10 wealthiest countries in the OECD. We want a country where housing is affordable for all New Zealanders rather than a major threat to our financial stability. Mr Speaker, if an outside observer was to look at this country, they would say they must do better and land use planning. In particular, Mr Speaker, for some of the poorest people in this country who are Māori and who also have the least access to housing. And isn't it a shame to see how the Māori Party have held up this legislation? Mr Speaker, it is very clear to the people of New Zealand who want substantial Resource Management Act reform in the next government who they have to vote for. Mr Speaker, on behalf of the ACT Party, I oppose this bill. and the hope that in future we will have something better and more substantial to vote for all New Zealanders. Thank you.